Welcome to another Fireside chat here on my channel. And today's guest is Will Price. And for those of you who have seen the documentary Finding Satoshi, you will have seen that he made some major contributions to this movie. And we are here together today in order to kind of discuss it and check, what he has to say about the hypothesis that was forwarded in the movie. Essentially, I'm not sure he will have time now to explain it, what his own opinion is, but the movie essentially came out that Satoshi Nakamoto was a tandem of Hal Finney and Len Sassaman. Unfortunately, both of them are not with us anymore for a long time now, for 10, 15 years. And so they cannot really be interviewed anymore. But that's kind of the idea of this chat here. So, Will, thanks a lot for being available to us here. That's a great honor to have you here. And can I kindly ask you to introduce yourself, in particular in the context of PGP and the circumstances that you elucidated essentially in the movie, and for all the probably endless interviews you've done, which were not documented in the movie.
Right. Thank you. I was getting my master's degree in computer science at USC in 1995, and on the side, I was writing some software, and I called it Cryptdisk, and that years later became PGP Disk. And because I was writing this, I got to know um, someone who was working with Phil Zimmerman, who created PGP in 91. And at the time, Phil was, it was, Phil would say, he's not really the best coder. He's a pretty good coder, very technical guy, but he didn't really want to do all the coding. And there was a lot of it at that point because PGP was becoming somewhat popular. So he was taking on some employees who would be willing to work without pay. And I was going to be one of them. And so that I started working with him around 94, 95. And two people were on that team in addition to me. One was Hal Finney, and the other was a guy named Colin Plum. And so Colin would write the extreme low level crypto. Basically, you still use Colin's code if you are connecting via SSL or things like that. Almost certainly down there, there's a package called BigNum, which was created by Colin as part of our work there. And so Colin and Hal and I were all working for Phil. More, the definition of working for free is a little vague. Colin would be, like given food, uh, things like that. It was an interesting scenario. And of course, Hal was at home and had a family and children. So his scenario was a little different, but he was, so strongly a believer in the PGP project that, he did this regardless. At some point, right during this era that I joined on, they started to try to get Phil Zimmerman on, international arms trafficking for exporting source code, and this is well covered in the film. And we all, of course, believed so very much in this project that made no difference to us. We continued working on it, and Phil eventually, I was on the phone with him January 11th, 1996. And he got a call from his lawyer, and they dropped the charges, and just a few days later, we were forming a company. So we'd all been working on this for years, and now we were forming a company, and all these people who were working for free are suddenly actual employees of the PGP Corporation. Now, our focus was obviously email encryption, right? The concept was to take PGP and turn it into a commercial product, which more or less happened over the decades. Um, but we had many different kind of founding goals. Anonymity, security, privacy were the three words that we kind of drove things on. Um, Anonymity was not something you saw as an end product that we, focused on that much, but it was certainly something that we were dealing with internally. Something that Hal was very big on. It was I had a couple notes here for dates. Hal announced a cryptographic remailer in 1992. So, in the era that he was working on PGP, he was also working on these anonymous remailers. So, anonymity to Hal was something that goes back to the beginning of his interest in this general area. Uh, it's it's something that we were certainly focused on, but never quite productized. The As we go forward into the PGP company, eventually in 1997, we were sold to McAfee because our first CEO spent all the money on PGP sushi and all sorts of other uh, somewhat questionable expenses. So eventually, we were part of McAfee for 4 years. Hal did come over with that transition. Colin did not. And so, eventually kind of the band broke up and companies have issues that kind of nonprofits don't. But we spun out again around 2001 because, McAfee was just not a good home for the technology because we were interested in actual things like anonymity, privacy, and security. And they were interested only in profit, which is fine, but it was not we're doing this for. So we became our own company again. Hal did not come over. At that point, he was, he needed a job and like anyone. And so he stayed at what was then called Network Associates, McAfee. And he was maintaining PGP command line, basically, which is the, kind of the traditional old school PGP from 92. During that time at McAfee, Hal met Len Sassaman. And we had assigned Len Sassaman to be the QA engineer, basically, for PGP command line. So he was working directly with Hal. Essentially, Hal would write the code, Len would test the code. Len, he didn't work for us for too long. He was there maybe a year. I would say that, even Len would probably say that kind of day-to-day grind work at a corporation was not his cup of tea. And so at some point he moved on before we spun out again. At that point, I was director of engineering. So from, originally I was just working with Hal and really Phil was just running things because we only had 4 people. But by this point, I was director of engineering. And so I was more or less managing Hal from, 97 or so. Now, when we spun back out, Hal had his own, thing, and we were not, he was not an employee anymore of the new corporation. I, of course, always wanted to get Hal back. One of the most important things that I wish we had more time in the film because I did give these interviews. There's so much content. Just they could do a 2-season TV show with the content from me, I think. But one of the topics that I really covered, and there are clips of it, if you can just put back together what I call the dinner table analogy. I wanted to get Hal back as quickly as possible. He was by far our best cryptographer. And, there are people in cryptography who are academics, I don't want to impugn anyone. There's nothing bad about being an academic. But, Whit Diffie, for instance, the guy who created Diffie-Hellman, co-created, is an academic, as he would no doubt note. And you don't really expect him on the side to create various products and distribute. It's just sort of certain people are engineered in certain ways. But Hal was the kind of person who was constantly applying crypto. And the concept of cypherpunks introduced in the movie was what we were all kind of about. But Hal was less of a cypherpunk, because I think cypherpunks, despite the slogan being, we write code, they didn't write enough code. The cypherpunks were way too, study and talk and post messages, and there was not enough code being written. And I was so about code that really I would only interact with cypherpunks to say, hey, we have a new version of PGP, and that was really my job all along. So that was what I
Yeah,
focused on.
even though Hell was quite active, even under his real name, he might have had some pseudonyms or so. I don't know, but like he was visible on all these news groups, the cypherpunks mailing list and the cryptography mailing list, which kind of is often seen as a successor of the cypherpunk mailing list that was mainly in the 90s, I think, and the cryptography mailing list started, I think, in the early 2000s or so, just roughly. So he was, I mean, of course, and I had these discussions before, right? I mean, Cypherpunk is not a formal membership. I mean, there are some documents, right, which were, some of them were extremely radical, and some people turned this way, the other one that. But whenever you ask people, were you or are you a cypherpunk, you get different answers, right? Like, so most people say, yeah, I was on the list, but I wasn't really like 100%. So there's not like a 100%, all of them were essentially about online anonymity, pretty much the points you just said, right? Like all of them were about online anonymity, security, and what was the third one?
Privacy.
Yeah. But I think that was kind of the common denominator, but then there were many variations of the theme, right? Like how people saw themselves. Some people were just following the list, maybe never really posting. Some of them were posting under different pseudonyms every couple of months, and so that would be my kind of understanding. But Hal and Len, so Hal Finney and Len Sassaman, were definitely contributors to the list and put out their particular views, right? And
Right.
you said you posted mainly on PGP in the
So,
days.
the I think this goes back, and this can be touched on in various aspects of this whole topic, to Bill Zimmerman and the government pressing charges against him. We believed so strongly in privacy, security, and anonymity that the fact that he was being attacked like this meant that we wanted to work harder. We were like, you've got to be kidding me, right? We have to make this work. We have to print T-shirts with the RSA encryption algorithm on them to prove the silliness of making laws that say you can't have this. And we're using the First Amendment to get around it. So we believed in this so much that we wanted to keep going. And Phil, of course, wanted to keep going because he had to get some way out of this. So the watching our boss get prosecuted for what we believed to be basic First Amendment, publishing math, basically, was a formative experience in our lives. We're going to base everything in our lives after that on that. So, that's 94 that begins. So for 2 years in, every newspaper, every few weeks was an update on how our boss was being prosecuted by, specifically people like Senator at the time, Joe Biden, And the whole, line of people who felt that encryption was something that needed to be regulated heavily by government, that we needed the Clipper chip, and that was a little later, but all these different things where there needed to be back doors into cryptography, and that Phil Zimmermann was going to be made an example of. So it produced a lot of people who worked for us, like Al, who held this knowledge that you had to be anonymous. Like, if this were ever to be done again, you better not do it, when you're like a taxpayer with a social security number and you're easily findable and easily imprisonable. That would be a bad thing.
So Phil
And we all
Zimmerman
knew
should
that.
have done the Satoshi Nakamoto game, ideally, right?
Right. Right.
The creator of PGP should have played that Satoshi game that you'd essentially never find out, at least not definitively, who it was and where it comes from, and played this kind of like pseudonym game that cannot be tracked down to a civil identity. But you were kind of creating only the tools then, right? Like Satoshi used them, like Tor, PGP. Even though I'm not really sure whether he used PGP that much, at least I cannot recollect that he really. I mean, he knew PGP, of course. He mentioned it, I think. But as far as I know, he didn't use it in his emails, at least. I might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, but yeah, okay, that it comes from, and that was also, you look, I grew up, I was there in the on the internet in Europe, and those who were on the internet in the early 90s remember that there was something like Netscape, and when you did the European download, it wasn't that because it wasn't used for emails in the early phase so much, but it was about this RSA encryption that you could only get a reduced security kind of encryption, and only US citizens were allowed to kind of download the full version, at least in brief, right? So that was also part of this export restrictions. Encryption was a little bit so like a digital weapon, or regarded as a digital weapon in these days by the US administration, right? That's maybe
Right.
a short form of how it was regarded at the time. It's probably a little bit unthinkable in these days, but that was the case in the, let's say, early mid 90s, when the internet just got exploded, essentially, with the World Wide Web exploding, and pretty much everybody getting access to it, not just a couple of academics and maybe military and Secret Service agencies who were there already in the 70s and 80s. Good. So
Right.
you
And
guys,
so,
please go
uh,
on.
um, so when we're, the charges all get dropped. Now we're doing this commercially. Uh, and one thing that came up while I was thinking about your comments just now is, there was a post in '94 from Hal, for pay remailers, where the concept was no one wanted to run these remailers. And you wanted the people who didn't care that much to run the remailers, because the whole system benefits from having lots of different remailers. In other words, it's sort of this decentralized concept, of the servers from Bitcoin. 15 years earlier, you need a lot of different nodes, and so Hal's post in '94 was about having rewards for running these servers, just like a Bitcoin validator later. So you take, the concepts from Bitcoin, and one thing that I was doing in all the different interviews and the years we spent making this film is, it caused me to go back and review the decades of communications and notes and things like that with Hal, um, about all these various topics. And so going all the way back to, when he is using a 2400 baud modem in '92 to run his anonymous remailer. And then, the internet comes out, and now he's got, hey, we need 4-pay remailers. We need lots of remailers. anonymity was a huge focus. So we've got anonymity being a huge focus from before the internet, even for Hal. We've got um, his drive to uh, not get into the same situation as his boss, Phil Zimmerman, um, by publishing any kind of crypto or any kind of uh, society changing software. I think we all believed in our software and we believed that it was going to accomplish and provide a new level of privacy or security or anonymity, depending on the specific piece of software. And, it was a mission for all of us.
So
Eventually, it
essentially, what you
became,
need for this anonymity is essentially in the Bitcoin language is decentralization, right? So you don't want
right,
agencies or anybody to point the finger at a single source of failure or attack, right? And
right,
the problem is for that, as you said, you need a lot of nodes who are kind of sharing the load. So at some stage, nobody can find out who actually kind of did it, right? And the problem with that, and also similar concepts like BitTorrent, which was kind of a file sharing platform amongst others, was that you need to economically incentivize the participation in these networks. Let's say with file sharing, even it's very obvious. Like if some people offer essentially their bandwidths that they usually have to pay for in the real world, right? Then and other people were just downloading, that would kind of run out of bounds if there was no incentive to provide all this bandwidth, right? So all
right,
these decentralized platforms needed a way to reimburse the ones who doing the most of the service. But that couldn't really be like a dollar checking account or anything, because then you could pin down these people by their bank account essentially, right? So there had to be some internet
right,
currency to make this whole, let's say, decentralization game worthwhile participate. So not just passively, but actively, right? So that was
right,
kind of that was maybe that's my understanding, one strong reason why this whole concept would best work if there was an internet currency that could be not traced down by public, the same guys essentially that put the threats on Zimmerman and maybe also some criminals or so. And of course, there were internet current or like digital currencies like eCash and some other stuff like New Liberty Dollar and so on, in the 90s and 2000s. But most of them got attacked or eventually taken down essentially because the government didn't want them. I put it very simply to issue something that could be a competition to the US dollar or the traceability of transfers and so on, right? I think that
right.
was a certain drive. So this online anonymity was coupled to this decentralization, and those who cared about anonymity, there were also some commercial players who weren't so worried about that. But so like they had payment systems and so on, but they were all centralized. So essentially there was a central log file and an incorporated entity that could be legally challenged for what they're doing, and a lot of them were. And at some stage, essentially all these startups either never made it to the surface, or they were taken down for essentially legal reasons most of the time. Is that a correct kind of
Oh, yeah.
reflection of very roughly what was the breeding ground for the 2008 Bitcoin, right? That's why the anonymity was so important and the decentralization was so important,
Right.
which kind of ties into what you said there, the problems that initially occurred with PGP.
So you have this track where it starts from Hal's 1994 4-pay remailers concept through, eventually Tor, the many node internet anonymity browsing service, and BitTorrent before that, uh, and so in other words, that was something that actually I would credit Hal to some degree with back then. So on one hand, he's on the remailers, anonymity, multi-node security. His concern in 94 was, hey, we need chained payments from one server to the next in order to make this work. This is going to rely on credit cards. That's a terrible idea. How do we make this workable? And he's proposing at that point, why don't we look at Chaum's DigiCash, who's mentioned in the film. And, we met with Chaum a few times in like 98, thinking we would acquire his company. They were having some issues, because again, PGP was privacy, security, anonymity. We wanted to do all these things, just never found the, corporate energy to kind of go forward on the digital cash side. And we felt like it wasn't quite a solved problem. And we were so focused on, PGP itself that we just didn't have time. So that's one side of things, is that Hal's going down this anonymity path. And he's thinking about that in terms of the security provided by the multi-nodes, which was kind of the thing then, right? Whether it's Tor or BitTorrent, eventually Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. So on the other hand, we have digital cash. And this had always been kind of Hal's number one. It's either number one or number two. Anonymity might be number one for Hal. So he's doing this. Eventually, as I was mentioning earlier, we spun out from McAfee, and now Hal's not with us. And I'm like, this is my best cryptographer. I've got to get this guy back. But I didn't want to immediately poach all the employees back from Network Associates because they'd spun us out, and the other option was shutting us down. So
that's just for reference. We're talking about the early 2000s, kind of like, so a few years before Bitcoin, right?
So it's now 2001. And we're trying to kind of cleanly separate ourselves from Network Associates / McAfee. Hal is remaining at Network Associates in our transition. We bring like 50 employees over. And now we're PGP Corporation again.
And that was the time when Len Sassaman was at your PGP.
So Len Sassaman had left just a bit before that. He worked for us for a year. But I would just say this. Len was that was when you had your
original PGP, or that was when you were in that
So there are three incarnations of PGP. First one, we formed a little startup right after the charges were dropped. That was 96 and 97. First CEO spent all our money. We had to immediately sell to McAfee. So that's 97 to 2001. Now, that's kind of everything was fine then, but there was not a lot of creativity going on. We were inside a massive corporation. And so in 2001, they were like, this doesn't make enough money. We're either spinning this out or shutting this down. And so we got new VC funding and we spun out. So 2002.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you there. I mean, I think it's a hoax or so, but I mean, John McAfee, right? He said he died a few years ago, that he knew who Satoshi Nakamoto was. Was he still involved? Or, I mean, he sold the company quite early,
so
right?
John McAfee
it was just a name, but he was not really at the company anymore when you were there, right?
Right. I mean, despite working there for years, I never met John McAfee. I've seen him on videos and all these things, but he was not involved. And so I don't think he ever actually met Hal. And then so, I have no further comment on him per se.
But was he still owning the company? I think he sold it, actually.
Probably.
Sure. So it was only the name, right? But the ownership transferred. I think this guy got a golden handshake for selling it to Network Associates. But I think that might have been even much earlier, People can look it up on the internet.
So right before we got acquired was whatever happened to John McAfee. That's when that happened. And so I came into a kind of crazy corporation that had just been radically restructured. Its founder had left or been ejected in some dramatic fashion. They were trying to reinvent themselves. And part of their reinvention was, hey, let's get into security and encryption and all these things. And this whole PGP thing is available at a bargain of, 35 million or whatever it was. And why don't we get into all these new things? So, but John McAfee himself was not involved at that point. So if you go through it, basically what I would say Hal was doing in that like 18-month period when I couldn't hire him back was he was writing RPow. And, that's all well documented on the internet. And we mention it in the film.
So
But
it's called, just for the
reusable,
audience, reusable proof of work, and that kind of was published by him in 2004, 2005, 2006. I mean, at least that's the bibliographical record, right? Just
right,
to put that into perspective. So he probably spent a year or two on developing it in the preceding year. So that's kind of
right.
early 2000s, right? Okay, sorry
So,
for
so the
interrupting.
way that essentially we figured out how to bring Hal back was, and it wasn't something we necessarily engineered so much as it was the obvious choice, was that Hal left Network Associates of his own volition, so that his later hiring by PGP Corporation was just a completely separate event, and we weren't poaching him. And in that intervening 6-month or so period, he wrote RPow, and so when he came to me, and we're discussing in 2003, 4, hey, let's bring you back. Uh, he releases RPow the day we hire him. Because he wants that to be very clear that this is his own separate work. And in his employment agreement, it says, there's a special page on software engineer employee agreements, and it says, what do you do that isn't part of your work? Because otherwise, everything you think of and everything besides your bathroom visits is your work as a software engineer typically. So he specifically calls out RPow and he describes all these things. And in my discussions with him on hiring him at that point, he was like, hey, I've done this great thing that I really believe in. It is, as he has said publicly, the most fun he's had in his career is developing RPow. And so this is something that he doesn't want part of work, and he's going to work on it, he tells me, and I approved this. He's going to work on it while working for PGP Corporation to some extent. And so periodically over time, we would discuss RPow, and we would, for instance, he went to a conference and gave talks about it in 2005 actually at Lens CodeCon 2005 conference. He presented World of RPow. And so periodically I would approve, him to take time off or do these various things. This was a supported project that had always been in his employment agreement as a outside thing. And so he continued developing it, going to conferences, talking about it, working with Len specifically on it.
But
So,
Len was like, so we're talking about the mid 2000s, right? But then Len was not on your payroll, right?
right. So that was sort of a good thing, right? Because Len, if he was on the payroll, if he was an employee, then it would look even more like Hal was doing a work thing. And again, as a Silicon Valley software company at the time, everything you did had the risk of contamination with whatever your work was. You really just wanted to only do work, and if there was something outside, it was difficult. And so he had called it out. He discussed it with me frequently, and we just always made sure that there was a little line between work and RPow. And so the fact that Len was someone he knew, someone he'd worked with testing his stuff. In other words, they already had this kind of working relationship. Len was not a coder at all. And I've heard people claim otherwise. And I'm like, okay, I knew
Well,
Len
I
for years,
also,
literally employed Len.
to everybody, actually, I have a lot of people who work with Len, and they would like fully support what you just said, right? Like
Right,
he was a great activist. He did some stuff. He did remailers and so on, but he wasn't a, let's say, ingenious software engineer who'd bring things
right,
across the line. That's kind of the consensus. So that would fully support what you just said.
right. So now, World of RPow, which is what Hal presented at Len's CodeCon 2005 conference. And the words in the film are a little bit, there's some editing going on. What the real key is, World of RPow. And there's some weird history on the internet around these pages were taken offline at some point, and then there was some date shenanigans. So it's almost like someone might have wanted to disassociate World of Our Pal from time. and and that might have to do with you don't want, as Hal, if Hal created it, to directly connect World of Our Pal to what later became Bitcoin, because World of Our Pal, I mean, basically is Bitcoin. Now, of course, it's a later version of it. We fixed some things, but RPAL was this thing where Hal was developing, and it was kind of a centralized mint. There wasn't really like have a different nodes to any significant degree. And so World of RPAL was coming in and saying, this is very difficult. You have this one centralized trusted party. You don't want to be a centralized bank. That causes all kinds of problems. Let's do a distributed, more like Tor and the anonymous remailers and all these things. Let's do a distributed network of approval, and this is where the whole blockchain concept comes from. Was World of RPAL, and so this is now, literally, he's presenting this publicly in 2005, and whether it was hidden on the internet or what that whole story is, it was his thing, and he presented it.
Well, it wasn't
And Len
actually
was literally running it.
at least I mean, evidently that was like with, I have a small circle of experts who consult me because I wasn't around at the time, and also I'm also not a professional cryptographer. I mean, I can understand what's done, but I'm certainly not known to be a cryptographer and don't claim to be. And they all told me that at this DEF CON conference in 2005 that you were just referring to, it was actually a demo, right? So he announced on one of these mailing lists in advance of the conference that he's looking for people who would try it out, right? So it's as far as I understood, it was a demo where he kind of had the code all put together, maybe like an alpha version, and wanted to test it in the wild. That's how I understood roughly
Right.
his email prior to the conference, and then he presented in some form of a workshop or so, or some, not like the main program, but sometimes they're like presentations or rump sessions or something like that. And so it was presented there, and from the people who I got notice of, or some of them you can also read on recollections, journalists and so on made whatever, like a summary of this. And they said that he, like the code was downloadable, right? It was like this RPAL was mainly coming down to, instead of an entity, there was a special processor that Hal Finney used that was kind of taking away like the power of a single person to edit essentially the ledger, but like that was essentially a specific, I forgot the name, a processor that he handed over the trust to. So if you trusted the processor, there wouldn't have been any way that somebody else or like could go into God mode
Right.
and edit the ledger.
So
So the
so
trust was not
the
decentralized, but on the ledger essentially, instead of on a centralized ledger, but that was essentially ruled by logic and not by a single person, right? Who could
right.
just whatever
So
have reverted
so
transactions and so on.
so so what he was releasing is RPAL, and that code went on the internet. It's out there. In fact, just this weekend, someone was like resetting it up and running it, and you can go right now and go get some RPAL tokens.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
and the critical step, which he presented, right? He's saying, "Hey, look, here's RPAL. You go take it, use it. It's cool." The critical step is that it is a centralized server that creates, based on hash cache, a value transfer system from one computer to another, basically. So the critical step there is to remove the dependency on the IBM 4758 secure crypto coprocessor card that we used for work. And so Hal had, we just had these things, we had a bunch of them, and Hal was using that as hey, this is your secure brain inside your computer that cannot be tampered with, right? It was FIPS approved. It was like this government approved, secure, central coprocessor inside your computer that uh, you could trust as your centralized entity. If you believe in a centralized approval mechanism, then this is the card for you. But of course, that just seemed like a huge security problem. And so Hal is presenting at the conference saying, here's RPAL, go use it. It's cool. It uses this IBM 4758 card. Why don't we distribute this? That's what I want to talk to you about is world of RPAL, and I want to distribute this and have multiple nodes, et cetera. But that was not working code at the time. That was what Hal was like, this is where I'm taking this. I'm going to take RPAL to a world of RPAL. So that is essentially from there, and that was early 2005. The question is, okay, what is Hal doing? How busy is he? When is he going to do this side project? How can he transfer? How can he create world of RPAL from RPAL? And basically, I think the next 3 years until 2008, 10/31/2008, that we are figuring out how to do that. And one of the things you realize is, hey, I need to be pretty darn anonymous. And that doesn't mean like, let's set up one remailer. Like this is, when you actually know, and this is your day job, being anonymous, and it's also your night job. You are thinking through the basics, right? You're not just like, right. Again, you're not just setting up a remailer. You are setting up, you are making a list. This is part of the task is how would you make a NIM is what they were called at the time, a pseudonym. And, you'd have a name and you'd have all these different aspects. You might automate different emails. You might do, stylometry prevention. You would have all kinds of different aspects where you are making yourself anonymous. And going back to the dinner table analogy that I made in the film, there you don't need a big dinner table of people in the whole world capable of doing what Bitcoin represents, right? Who is it in the world? How many of them? Well, my job for 20 years was hire the people who can do these things. Find them, hire them. I was one of the great ones. How many others were there? Right? How many, we had one guy from Russia, Andre, who, he was an actual, like defector from Russia. That's how hard it was to find a good applied cryptographer. And I don't mean academic cryptographers. So you have to exclude anyone who, you have to take Whit Diffie and say, well, he's not a coder. He's not writing the software. So he's not going to do it. So you need to find people like Hal, people like Andre, people like Colin, who'd worked with us early on. So, I think I just named them all. Like that, there might be a couple more, but a party of 6, maybe. And these are the people who okay, they're capable of these things. They've released software before. They do this professionally. They know what testing is. They know what QA is. They know what the software process is. They are in fact driving their whole lives based on anonymity, security, privacy, and all of these cypherpunk vision. And in fact, digital cash and doing this, going back all the way to posts in 94 and earlier, has always been Hal's vision. And what he had specifically excluded in 2004 or 5 was RPAL, then world of RPAL, then the clean progression. And I'm his manager during this period. So I know, where are his thoughts? What is he doing? What does his code look like? And I mean, sometimes it's hard for me because I am like, no, you don't understand. I was there. Like we didn't say the word Bitcoin because that was a very late invention in this whole process, right? Where I'm looking at it from like, the 94 perspective. But RPow was something we talked about all the time, right? How do we turn RPow into world of RPow? And Bitcoin is essentially the implementation of world of RPow. And, in my perspective, Len was the person who then came in and said, hey, because he always he really did revere Hal. Everyone revered Hal, but Len especially. And I think, his drive to kind of help Hal realize this vision. And the fact that he was just really good at white papers, right? Len was like the guy who would hold conferences, write white papers. That was his thing. He was more of an academic. And so that's why you look at this Bitcoin white paper and you almost think, well, this guy must be like a cryptography professor because it's done in such a well-formed way. So simple. It's only 9 pages, but it's very profound and well written.
Can I just for clarification, if you call say like world of RPow, right? What would you mean? Like just that the currency essentially how it gets
Yes.
disseminated and rolled out, but not a formal organization or so. That was your internal terminology for making this really happen as a digital currencies, an anonymous digital currency, essentially. Is that what you mean, or how would you define this world of RPow?
So first, I would insert the caveat to the user of the internet has likely been corrupted regarding the history of world of RPow. And so if you go and Google things, you might need to use, the Internet Archive and things like that. And so for me personally, I just have copies of all this because I downloaded them. And so I know that it's a stable archive. So hopefully it's all there. I think it's all there on the Internet Archive, but it has been at various times removed. Exactly as I said, what happened with that, I don't know. But essentially, the world of RPow is saying, hey, let's use a shared database. And I'm actually reading a quote from it. Let's use some kind of shared database so that all of the other servers would see the same update, right? So here's the first sentence that is basically, let's go from RPow to blockchain. RPow and world of RPow, their fundamental issue was preventing double spend without a shared blockchain. And so world of RPow simply transitions from RPow being the IBM 4758 coprocessor as the way to prevent double spend because you have a trusted centralized third party. 2, let's use a server cluster to record the same knowledge many times cryptographically and basically compare it. And then you have the same thing as long as you can trust certain basic core concepts like you have enough servers and enough servers are well behaved and certain rules. But the critical step is remove the centralized coprocessor where, even what if there's damage to the card? What if you have a power surge? Whoop, nobody has money anymore. I mean, it's a problem. And so for various reasons, whether it's, decentralization or others, you want to remove the centralized dependency, right? And this now is this has become its own whole field, decentralized finance. So the operators of RPow systems, again, quoting from of World of RPow, will cooperate and coordinate their activities in this, blockchain node network, just like the remailer node network. In other words, these were concepts that Hal had been working on for decades. And that, by the way, Len, who was, Bram Cohen's roommate, who invented BitTorrent, was also very familiar with. And so the concept was, hey, we already have RPow. It's literally written code. It's right here. And I can work on it safely outside work. And my boss supports it. So we're all good. So why don't we now spend the next 3 years, all my free time, writing Bitcoin? Which I'm not sure the free time point is really made quite as lengthy as I made it on film, but they get the basic point across, which is that there were no commits at all from 10/31/2008 to whatever it is, January of 2009. So with release of Bitcoin on the 8th. So no commits. Now, I made in my own source repository probably 23 commits yesterday. Like this is abnormal. You have an employee who works for you full time as a software engineer. They commit most days. And if they don't commit on a particular day, then at the end of the week, they're committing a week's worth of work. That's how software engineering works. So how you get 2.5 months of nothing, it doesn't happen. I mean, unless they are ill or on vacation. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but here I have to take you in a friendly infight, right? So
yeah.
we have to distinguish, right? There is technically, we agree, probably your opinion there weighs much more than mine, but that Hal Finney would have been capable technically and probably from the mindset to have been Satoshi Nakamoto. We're not talking about a lack of skills and this clear path from ARPAO to Bitcoin, and the he was certainly aware that that would have to be done anonymously with Phil Zimmerman's unfortunate experiences in his kind of PGP in the early 90s. Okay, I think that would be bought by a lot of people, but still let's start with what you said, right? It's quite plausible. I mean, Satoshi said it. Well, everything that Satoshi said might have been a red herring, right? But there's some stuff, there's some plausibility. And he said, okay, I developed Bitcoin over the last 18 months. I think he said that somewhere in mid 2009. So he probably started Bitcoin in 2007, right? Spring or summer or something. If you just take these 18 months that he said there, roughly like mid 2007. And that's very plausible, right? To pull off such a project with all the coding, the novelty of the project, a a time of 1 year to bring it all together, would be good, would be realistic, right? It would even be probably quite ambitious for a normally gifted person, but Hell was more than normally gifted, right? Then he had essentially the code already out in mid-November, right? So he released a code version to select people. Actually, the code version, as far as I know, is even available because some of these people that he shared it with was releasing it. At least there's some documented talk on the cryptography mailing list that he was to share the code, and it was evidently shared, I think, on something like mid-November, so roughly 2 weeks after he released it. Actually, one of the early responders was Hal himself, right? So if Hal was the coder of Bitcoin as portrayed or pitched in the movie, then he would have been very friendly to himself because he was the only one who was not primarily negative about Bitcoin, right? It got pretty much a little bit destroyed as the white paper was released. And there was the first responders were almost all exclusively extremely skeptical that it wouldn't scale, where is some truth to it actually. And so you're saying Hell would have picked up, I think, early November, so not even a week after Satoshi Nakamoto released the Bitcoin white paper, he would have jumped in and gave kudos to himself and then played around a little bit with it. So we know he did the first transaction after he reappeared in whatever, mid-January 2009. So he would have been the guy who does like a dual kind of play. On the one hand, I'm Satoshi Nakamoto. On the other hand, I'm Hal Finney. And first thing I do is give myself kudos for how great I developed the code. I mean, that's not impossible, but like that would be an immediate consequence of Hal Finney having been the mastermind and coder of Satoshi Nakamoto, right? There's even like then he disappeared. Maybe that was related to some symptoms he had or diagnosis of his fatal disease, ALS. And then he reappears end of 2010, pretty much almost in the same couple of days when kind of Satoshi Nakamoto kind of disappeared, at least from his own Bitcoin forum mailing list, and gives something like somebody kind of said, "Oh yeah, there's a terrible code and awfully written and structured and so on." And then Al enters the scene and kind of gives a big kudos to Satoshi Nakamoto. And then Satoshi Nakamoto said something like, "Thanks a lot. It means so much to that it comes from you, Hal. Thank you very much." I think something like in that sense, right? So he would have been kind of clapping in his own shoulder at the same time. Why did he disappear from the scene? Right? Well, like, I mean, there's how would you explain that? Because it's not the logic you portrayed, I think, makes a lot of sense, right? It's just more the contradictions that this would um, kind of imply. If that was all true, essentially, Hal Finney would have been the biggest cheerleader for Satoshi Nakamoto, who was himself, right? Would that like how would you see that?
Right. So Meredith mentioned this in the movie Len's wife, K anonymity. You want a bigger crowd, basically, because it makes you less findable. The concept here, I think, is first of all, you have someone who's really quite an expert at anonymity. So he's going to think through these things. Two, we've already presupposed now there are multiple people involved in the Satoshi engine. So whoever have access to the email account, etc., multiple people involved. So who is writing back to who? I can hear. In fact, that's one of the messages for me where I hear Len. I mean, this is exactly how Len would say it. That's Len. Is that message that says, it means so much coming from you, Hal. Okay. As I said earlier, Len revered Hal. Okay. So this is exactly how they would interact. And so if you want to have and go back to the dinner table analogy, okay, you have 6 people who could have written Bitcoin. Most of them worked for us and they were all on the cypherpunks list, et cetera, et cetera. So of these people, you have to establish you're not the guy on the other side of the table. You're this other person. Because if you're the CIA or the FBI and you are looking for this Bitcoin guy, right? Because of Silk Road and everything that came after this, right? You're
Yeah, but
thinking,
Silk
okay,
Road was
someone's going
far,
to come
right?
after.
So we're talking about I called it the Satoshi era, right? Which was roughly from end of October 2008 until either the final like just before Christmas 2010, and then there were a couple of more or less emails to peer, but like he disappeared from the public Bitcoin forum and crypto forum, at least as Satoshi Nakamoto, right? So the Silk Road was years after that departure,
Right, right.
right? And Len was
But
already gone. Like Len
I
was
think
already gone then.
the flavor of Silk Road is the same as Bill Zimmerman getting prosecuted by the government. What you have in both instances is a reinforcement of the government is coming after you if you do these things. If you write this code, if you get into this area, we're going to find you. And if you're one of those 6 people at the dinner table that we do our investigations and interviews and depositions, and we will figure out which of these 6 people you are, and we will find you and get you. And whether that is to press charges for, screwing up the banking system or whatever the charge is, this time we're going to get you.
Yeah.
And
But I mean, in fairness, I mean, and I don't mean you in particular because you have a lot of insights, right? But look, I wrote like for a couple of years now on and released pretty much everything I researched in my book, right? And a lot of people are reading it, right? And what I can like what I find is like once you run into contradictions, right? Then people start this kind of multi-person Satoshi, right? And I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but essentially when, you always say like, oh yeah, like Len couldn't code. So I mean, I'm not referring to you because you said that already, but some people say it was Len. And then you say, yeah, but he wasn't the greatest coder. Okay, then let's add a coder. And then you get a couple of timestamps which don't fit neither to Hell nor to Len, and then say, oh yeah, there was another guy, I don't know who, but let's add Mr. X to it, right? And the more, as you know, I have a mathematical background, and everybody knows, okay, the more variables or the more degrees of freedom to add to a mathematical fit to some data set, you can fit anything, right? So you have to really define, like, okay, was like in the movie, at least, or in the documentary, Finding Satoshi, they were pitching it, and I understand that might not completely reflect what you said in the extended interviews. Len was a coder, and no, Hell was a coder, and Len was a communicator and the author of the white paper, right? But who mined? Who had the mining machine, right? Because there was always like friend, maybe for some other reasons we might not want to get too deep into, but did Len have the miner, or was it Len, or was there another Mr. X who did that? Because that, if you have the evidence of the transactions, it looks most likely that after Len's passing, there were still transactions that you can trace back to the original Satoshi Bitcoin that everybody kind of agrees on, that, these 1 million, and we have the addresses with some Sergio Damian Lerner released how he kind of systematically found which Bitcoin Satoshi mined. And you can trace them, track them back to the original Coinbase rewards. And then you can see that there were intermittent transactions, not many, right? Not many, but there were some, and they happened after, let's say, Len Sassaman's passing. So definitely he didn't do it. So if you had a duo of Len and Hell, then it could only have been Hell, who lived pretty much 3 more years longer, but of course in worsening health condition. But yeah, then you would say, okay, like Len was a minor, or there was a key transfer between Len and Hal Finney, right? Otherwise, it's not explainable, or there was a third person. So what's your angle at that?
Um, there's certain, sometimes I'll just state my opinion and then I could spend 10 minutes explaining my opinion, but I'll start with my opinion here. Um, to me, this is, if you want to say, did Hal create Bitcoin? Yes. Just put a period on that
Technically,
sentence.
yeah. But what do you mean by create,
Uh,
right?
so
Set
I
the
think that,
idea, or did the code and release it,
right.
and was the, let's say, the brain of the coding of Bitcoin?
So I think Bitcoin could be called RPow 3.0.
Okay,
World of RPow would be RPow 2.0. Bitcoin is RPow 3.0.
okay.
They are a natural progression. And so to me, as a software engineer or with a software engineering background, when I say create, I look at this, 7-year period where Hal started RPow and it became eventually Bitcoin. I think that Len definitely helped. He helped things like managing, the mailing lists and forums, and and I think his main contribution is writing, or certainly editing and kind of managing the process of the white paper.
So you
To the
mean like,
extent
hmm,
to,
go
to the
ahead.
extent that Len was involved after that, after the white paper, it's a little vague. I think he was still involved somewhat casually, but Len was, um, I mean, I don't want to really get into what I think he would have done and not would have done, but I mean, I did know him for, decades. So um, I think Hal created Bitcoin and Len essentially wrote the white paper, under Hal's direction. In other words, it had already been created. You now need to kind of create this host to the cypherpunks list in a sense, except this is so momentous, and you've now put all the effort in creating the nym and all these things that you want to have it in a presentable form from a more academic perspective. You want to proof. Um, and that was what Len was really great at, right? If you look back, this is not really covered in the film, but one of the many things we did that took forever was, hey, let's get all of Len's white papers and let's compare them to the Bitcoin white paper. And I don't mean like, let's run some stylometry thing and, see if he capitalizes his, T's or something. I think that's all fun and that's all in the film. And I didn't really follow all that. It all makes sense to me and it's wonderful. But when you actually look at the content and the logic in Len's white papers, like the PKI layer cake white paper in 2009 as well, and many others before that. Anyway, so I have a whole list. So, and if you're an academic, right, and in other words, if you understand these kinds of white papers, you say, "Wow,
Well, I
this
am.
really seems
I've
like the
written
same
like,
author."
yeah, but the problem is like, I mean, I sorry for dissecting this, but I'm really like into this. Who is? I mean, I'm actually not even into trying to find out the civil name of Satoshi. I just try to scrutinize, which stories are plausible. And the issue I see is, I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto, other than the common narratives, wasn't really very political, right? And he never really emphasized the anonymity thing, which you would have kind of like what I got from various people, including John, is like even in the cypherpunk movement, Len Sassaman was a radical anonymity guy, right? And like the only or the biggest criticism people have, like when the white paper came out and Bitcoin kind of got a little bit traction especially in the cypherpunk community, a lot of people laughed it away, right? Because they said, oh yeah, like, okay, he sacrificed anonymity and only that way he got it to roll out, right?
Oh, you
And
mean the
and and a lot of
Bitcoin
people turned,
itself?
yeah, Bitcoin, right?
Right.
And that would be a complete mismatch as far as I understand how Len ticked, right, in his mind.
Ah.
That would have been put him off
Right,
Bitcoin
right.
pretty
So,
much immediately. And you even have these postings where he essentially destroyed Bitcoin. Now people say he had like some depressive thing, or when he got frustrated, he might have,
right,
switched exactly to the other direction, or it was part of a cover up, like a smoke and mirrors. But I
right,
mean, like it would actually fit that he would have never really stayed on board for several years on a project that would be like so weak on anonymity and in cypherpunk, most cypherpunks actually rejected, as far as I understood, Bitcoin just because of that failure to not
right,
really
right,
be anonymous, right? So, and the other
right.
thing is, so it's this anonymity, and the second thing is actually Satoshi, if you really read his messages, and we have all of them that he posted at least, and some emails, the word anonymity wasn't really that much in the foreground, and even more, the discussions that were run on the list were mostly technical, right? After 2009, right? Like it was all about, oh yeah, I found this bug, I issue this, I fixed this here in this function. So it was a very technical discussion where I could hardly see that somebody who was mainly having a cypherpunk political agenda like Helen would have
Right.
been
I
so
don't think a lot of
interested
that is
in it.
Len. Right. That's mostly. I don't think that a lot of that is Len. I think that Len had the ability to post and sometimes didn't.
Yeah.
Um,
So who did it? I mean, and if that theory
I think it
holds,
was Hal. I mean, essentially, right. This comes back to what I said before. It to me, Hal created Bitcoin, and yes, he had
yeah.
some help.
But okay, then
The
you take sorry, do you take the I mean just sorry for cutting across it, but I try to throw evidence at you, right? So I and others, but I trusted essentially or repeated that for just seeing whether I can replicate it, right? The timestamps of all the postings, right? If you map them to different time zones, essentially come down to an East Coast time zone as the most likely thing. Of course, people, maybe Hal not so much with his illness, but like people can
Right.
move around and go to conferences. So you don't have exactly, but if you take a statistical analysis, it seems like they were all posted from, well, I mean, you cannot post from the middle of the Atlantic, right? So it's either Europe or
I,
the
I,
US. But consistently, if I had to put my money on it, it would be Eastern or Near Eastern time zone. In Pacific time zone, he would have to essentially do his main postings often starting at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning. And that usually when you post something on the technical side, you usually um, made the assessment or did some code updates or so just before that, right? So he would have like for that, he would have been a person who would develop like get up in 4 in the morning to start posting at 6 because then he would have whatever like analyzed something or found something and then post. At least that's usually how it happens, right? So the timestamps would extremely contrast. On the one hand, Hal being the main poster on these technical topics, Hal Finney was mainly in Europe, right? So he would have had,
you mean Len?
yeah, sorry, yeah. Len was, he was that he was a PhD
Right,
student
right.
at the time at Leuven, which is near Brussels in Belgium. So, like those two even collaborating. I mean, you see that. Look, I'm sitting now in Ireland, which is even 1 hour closer to you, right? So if you coordinate two people between Pacific time zone and Central European time zone, you would have seen some significant delays, right? So the one, let's say, if Hal picked up the technical content, he would have worked on it. But then that would have been the middle of the night for Len or his office hours as a PhD student. That does, I mean, it's not completely impossible, but one of them would have had to live pretty much against his own daylight hours to a very extreme extent over essentially 1, 2 years, right? The
Right.
other thing,
I mean,
technic,
to me though, that whole time zone thing is, um, I've heard other people mention it, and it just doesn't make sense to me. And I guess as a software engineer, as the son of someone who was a writer, as the my grandfather and my I come from writers, and so throughout my work at PGP, throughout their writing, they have always described, and I describe how my schedule is completely off everyone else, right? So even at PGP, when I was VP of engineering there for many years, um, I would come in at 11:30, and I would work till 4:30 in the morning. That was normal, and so people define their own schedules. I remember Len as way off the normal schedule. I mean, if just kind of think of Meredith, think of Len's. I mean, if you knew Len, it's hard to express, right? If you didn't know Len, but that's totally normal. This whole separation from normal time zone, especially, I mean, to me for a PhD, like this is the exact kind of thing where you're having a very offset schedule potentially. And frankly, you just said a schedule where you wake up at 4 a.m. and they do that's how Tim Cook describes his own schedule. So
okay.
people
Let,
having their
let,
own
let's just take
schedules
that.
is
Yeah, okay. That, I
normal.
mean, like all the arguments, right? Are what I mean, I'm discussing there with some other people, and we call that probabilistic, right? So it is possible, and yes, cypherpunks, coders, and so on might have completely different schedules, especially if they don't have to share office hours, come into an office. So that might have all been the case. We have the anonymity thing where I have a difficult time seeing Lens. I mean, I could
Hmm.
see him having discussed it at RPro. I could have seen him, whatever,
Right.
like being friends. He knew certainly, as you said, like hell, they were friends, right? But I would have seen from my imagination, just like reasonable arguments, that he would have immediately jumped off board Bitcoin
Okay.
as he learned that anonymity was deprioritized,
Right. So there are
right?
two different tracks here. Track one is, hey, we're going to introduce Bitcoin. We better be anonymous. Meaning we, the author, we, Satoshi, we need to be unfindable. We need to make sure that that is the case. For years, we employed the guy who created Tor. We were all very familiar with the various anonymity issues. So I think Len certainly would have first obsessed over that because we are software engineers. Al, me, Len, we're all basically in that mode. That's what we do. So first, we're going to have anonymity for the project. We need to make sure that all these accounts we're creating, all of the ways we're releasing it, all the posts we make have a certain tone and can't be defeated by stylometry, et cetera. So that was already an obsession going back to, again, 1992 for both of them. I think Len would have definitely been very involved with that. And so I think early on at this kind of, maybe August to October of 2008 phase, I think Len was probably very deeply involved writing the white paper, making sure that all the aspects of the anonymity, the NIM solutions were in place. Now, then we get to track 2, which is, hey, Bitcoin could be a lot more private. Like, what's the issue? I can go track these things in the blockchain and I can kind of figure out, well, there's this IP address and there's this, if I'm the CIA, I have ways of really defeating a number of pseudo privacy aspects of Bitcoin. Again, we're software engineers. This is RPAL 3.0. There's going to be a next version, right? Like, we're not going to die of ALS and a suicide. And so we're going to continue, and there's going to be a next version. I know this has issues, but this has never been done before. It's hugely profound. It's going to change everything. And then we will have time to improve all these things, which are essentially bugs in the initial version. Now, remember, I'll release Bitcoin, the official code release in January 2009. He announces ALS in, I think it's August.
Pretty much
we
in
held
that same period, right?
Right. So it was the same year. This is like you
Oh,
have just released.
The diagnosis, as far as I know, was in 2009. So pretty much almost a year
Right.
after the release
So,
of the white paper and the code. That's at least what the documents say. I'm not sure whether you have. So
right.
that
So
was in
official
August
code
or
January. Official code January.
yeah,
Official
and then
ALS
only in
diagnosis
in
August.
August or later 2009. So almost like half a year after the code release,
Right. So
the
you've just
diagnosis
released.
arrived at yeah. Yeah, half a
You've
year.
just this year, you've just released the most important thing you may ever do, you think,
Yeah.
right? It's this huge thing that you've spent really many, many years on. And it is whatever you call it, RPAL 3.0 or Bitcoin 1.0, whatever it is. It is this new baby that you've had. You've really spent a lot of time on it, but now you are diagnosed with ALS. So what do you do? I mean, you cannot go and do, well, let's do Bitcoin 2.0 and we're going to revise all the privacy aspects of it, right? How was a practical applied cryptographer, right? We wrote PGP and all the things after it based on like, this is what we can do at the time. I understand that the web of trust in PGP in 1992 had issues, right? And in 1991, we had something slightly different from web of trust. We kept improving upon these concepts, frankly, for decades. Perfection is not necessarily the goal. I think the blockchain itself was the goal of RPAL 3.0, Bitcoin.
Okay.
That
But you
was the
have,
time.
yeah, that's fully understood. But let's say you have this, I think his name is Lop, right? He had this brilliantly researched article which shows that, I mean, even though Al Finney had ALS, he was still into running and I think also cycling and some triathlon. I'm not sure whether before or after, but he got into sports quite a bit and probably, I assume he noticed some symptoms then during that. But you had this proof that there was a Bitcoin transaction, I think in spring 2009, which took place exactly when he was kind of recorded
Right.
having participated in a competitive run. right? So I have some
Right.
whatever, some result table where a time showed up and even a picture and something that on a thing. So I assume that's not all fabricated. So that would definitely exclude Hal Finney as the one who owned all the who mined all the coins, right? So you're
I don't know
saying,
why. I mean, this first of all, this is covered in the movie, so I don't want to
yeah,
repeat too much of it. But I think there are other explanations that aren't necessarily mentioned in the movie that make this all fairly straightforward. I mean, the obvious one is Len made the transaction.
okay, so
Um,
he was sitting in Leuven and running a machine in his office. And so Len was the owner of the so-called Patoshis, so the ones that where the pattern of mining essentially says that it was a single miner, and that was the creator of Bitcoin, right? So you're saying like Hell was mining Bitcoin, but how could then he
well, there are
have
many,
happened
many
transact?
different wallets and keys associated with that time
Yeah,
period.
but you have like there's a very good analysis of the Bitcoin mining, right? And you have several evidence. I mean, it's always difficult to explain it. Maybe that goes too far, but there are good articles out there. Essentially, Lerner himself, who the person who came up with these statistical analysis of the mining that Satoshi did, and you see, for example, there are certain breaks in the mining, right? And then statistically, again, you can show that it's unrealistic that there were two independent miners. So it seems like that these breaks could have only originated from a single coordinated mining, or if there were several miners, they would have all kind of had to agree exactly to stop mining for a few hours up to a few days, right? So it's unreal. I mean, again, it's all like there. We can come up always with explanations, but it's most likely that there was only somebody like a single control of the mining. I so in the very simplest case, some like Satoshi was deploying a box, maybe not even at his own home or so, but that there was only one person coordinating the mining.
Okay, so I think personally, I think Len did that transaction, but um, why couldn't it be a cron job? I mean, there's so many ways
No,
to
because
answer
it's
this.
stopping, not the mining itself, but there were dedicated phases, right, where Satoshi evidently stopped mining for a few hours or a few days. That's very well documented. And that is not
Sure.
conceivable if you had different miners who
Just
acted
the
independently.
okay. So that's just analysis of time. That's easy to say. We're going to make sure we only mine from these periods to defeat the analysis of when we do these things, because we know there are these problems with the blockchain where you can analyze these things. Therefore, we need to make sure that the Satoshi NIM can't be revealed in those ways. So that's sort of a very simple problem that some people who don't spend decades on anonymity think, well, no one would think of that, but like they would think of that first. Um,
So
so
you're saying like maybe Len and Hell mined as Satoshi Nakamoto together, independently from each other.
and they coordinated times or what I mean, whatever
Okay,
ways that they knew of because they were creating this blockchain, they knew the flaws in it. Um,
but
all
who
you
would
have to
they?
do is coordinate the time.
Yeah, but
And
still,
okay, so
okay, so let's say, let me just, I always try, no, that's not anything against you, but I mean, my method as an academic, right? I'm the one true academic. I've been in academia for 30 years and wrote many papers, not on cryptography, on others, so that's what we do. We take a hypothesis. Let's say Len Sassaman and Hal Finney were Satoshi Nakamoto and try to lead it to contradictions. And then we find, okay, this hypothesis cannot be true, at least not in the form that it has been pitched, right? So the other thing about the mining is there was a track, like as I said before, there's a trail of transactions which go beyond Len Sassaman's death and with slightly less probability, but still quite likely, I would say that even after Hal Finney's death, And I mean, Hal Finney did have Bitcoin, right? Because he mined. He even said that he mined it. And Fran, his wife, said that he had a basket of Bitcoin, not 1 million, well, let's say a few thousand or something, and that's quite plausible. But that was probably regular mining, as he said. So after 2009, he had the computer on for a few weeks and probably fetched a few Bitcoin once in a while. But that means that both took the Satoshi fortunes, so roughly 1 million Bitcoin, into their graves, right? And they wouldn't have like they just hated Bitcoin so much, or they loved it so much that they wanted the secrecy of that. And it's a
Right.
different situation for Len, right? Because like it wasn't really in 2011, mid of 2011, it just started to have some significant value, and we're talking about $1, right? So if you take like a few thousand Bitcoin into your grave, that would be not a major strike, right? That's not a life-changing amount of money. In 2014, when Bitcoin was a 10 or 100 times as much, right? That would have implied that he would have denied millions of Bitcoin. It didn't have the value of today, but it was already traded. There were exchanges, and you could take it to exchanges, and so he would have denied his wife, who cared for him, that he loved so much. They had kids and probably some medical bills that were significant. That he would taken like something north of $1 million, not
I think
bequeath
that
it
Hal's
to his
statements
wife.
on this are accurate. Um, so there was some Bitcoin, and he used it. I think he said he used it for his medical
Yeah,
expenses, et cetera.
yeah, but he didn't
So
mind. He did it
that
as
is what
Hal
it is.
Finney. He mined it as Hal Finney as on a regular competition,
Right.
and that
But
wasn't 2009 mined Bitcoin in the quantities that Satoshi accumulated.
so I think what's important to remember on this topic, and this is one of the pieces that I wish had gotten into the film, going back to what I said a few minutes ago about we're software engineers. Um, the way that Hal is doing this is, he's got a couple of machines, which first of all were loud, big fans.
He
His
even said
wife
that, right?
Fran would
That's the,
complain
the
about
reason he
them,
said why he stopped. So that's plausible, right? If
right?
you had that in
So
your
like,
living room,
there's
yeah.
only so much mining he can do without experiencing marital strife. Um, and when you're writing these projects, right, it's like with PGP, right? We're doing key generation and key encryption and all these different things with keys. We are constantly generating keys, and as part of testing, this is just normal. And do I have the key that I tested with yesterday? No, no idea. Right, that was just a key. It's better that I generate a new key today because I'm doing new testing and I want to generate new keys and have that process tested every day, regardless. So as you're going through mining, there's this. I think people look back and think, well, where did he keep those wallets or whatever it is? Um, I don't think he kept them at all. I mean, he probably didn't keep them for a long time because,
Well, that is
again, this is
disproven.
archive
We
3.0.
know that. Sorry, we know that like Satoshi Nakamoto, again, going with these so-called Patoshis, right? They were bundled, right? Not many of them, right? Most of the million, nothing ever happened to them, at least so far not, right? But he bundled them, and you have like I did a very careful analysis on that, and had a chapter in my book, which took me quite long because it's not so easy to understand all these movements. So there were, like, let's say 100 Bitcoin or 200, something of that order of magnitude, that were moved in patterns that don't look like transfers, right? They look like a reorganization. So he took like I think 20 Bitcoin, 20 Coinbase rewards. So they were only 50 Bitcoin. But well, it's not so much how much he moved, but he bundled them, let's say in 2010, right? And then he merged them, moved them around a couple of accounts with probably some other coins he had, because otherwise that would just not make a lot of sense to do these motion. And then he merged them and ran them back into an account he had before, which is kind of weird, but that's at least an indicator that that was not to somebody else, right? And then he peeled off, so he had like tens of thousands of Bitcoin from his Satoshis merged with something else, and then he kind of stripped them off, sometimes in a single transaction, right? So like a single in a single block. He included several transactions, which was like a sequential split off, essentially, of small amounts. So whatever, he 10,000 and did whatever, I don't know, 100 Bitcoins or so, like
Right. So
10 times in the same. Yeah.
anything that happens in 2010 or related to this at this point is like we're now in the after period.
No, that was
Everything
in
is now
2010, in 2010, right? So Hell and Len were
right. That's
still
but that's
alive.
but in this concept, to me, this is very late. Right. I'm talking about when you generate the very early Bitcoin, I'm running Bitcoin, right? That tweet.
Yeah, but
We're
that
talking
was,
about the
sorry, is
very
that we're
beginning.
talking about, no, we're talking about 2009 mined ones. So that would show, so he bundled them, let's say in 2010. So whatever that move was, it was clear testament that he still owned the keys of the early 2009 mine. So in the very early beginnings, where he was pretty much the only miner, he still had ownership
Right.
of these things. So that kind of
So
shows that at least a significant amount of keys he still owned. So he didn't throw them away or burn them for the sake of the god of Bitcoin or something like that. He was in possession of these keys in, I say, 2010, and if you go down the line, probably even beyond Hal's unfortunate death, right?
uh
That is,
so I
again, there's
think
some
obviously
probability to
some of
it.
them, as he said, he had some Bitcoin. So we can assume, I think that there's definitely truth in that. And at that time, of course, it was a significantly lower value. And so that was
Yeah, pretty
whatever it
much
was.
nothing, right? So it was
To
probably some
the
testing whether certain transactions there was no, like, you're talking about ridiculous amount of money that they were worth. If it was all possible to even cash it out, because at the time there was no real exchange like a cryptocurrency exchange. But we do actually have proof that it was very likely, again, with Bitcoin transactions, he could have done that to somebody else. But it's very unlikely, if you go for a reasonable analysis, that he moved Bitcoin even to exchanges. So there was like a Canadian exchange, Vertec or something, where if you follow these things, they were actually moved into that exchange with a high likeliness that they were still owned by the original creator, so Satoshi Nakamoto, right? And again, with lower probability, but still some plausible linkage that even continued until 2018, I think, to Kraken. Again, the probability shrinks that they were still owned by the same owner, but I say the most likely path is that they didn't change ownership, because certain actions on the blockchain you don't do, or if you bought something, you don't usually don't buy everything for 1,000 Bitcoin, right? Like that's something you like. I mean, you usually pay the price for whatever it is, and if it's a large amount of money, you just don't give a tip to other people of thousands of Bitcoin. So that would contradict essentially the hypothesis that it must have been either that Hal or Len owned the Bitcoin and gave it to somebody else, the keys, but that wouldn't mean that the person who owned it or who received them kind of knew them, because Satoshi would have randomly transferred the keys to or the Bitcoin or even the keys to a person knowing that the keys would kind of reveal his identity. Like if you
so
gave me the keys now of your Bitcoin, if you have some, I would kind of know who it is, right?
I think
Like,
as
I
an
mean,
engineer, you look at this and you say, in early 2009, this is nothing, right? The value of Bitcoin is
exactly. That
something
was
like
just toy
zero,
money, just to play
right?
around with.
So now it's 2010.
Yeah.
You've been diagnosed with ALS. Bitcoin is now worth actual cents. Um,
Well, 20,000 Bitcoin
maybe
for two pizzas, right? So
right.
not much.
So now who knows, right? It might be worth something one day. Why don't I, as an engineer, organize my hard drive, see what wallets I have, put these all in something that represents some level of organization. And because I'm on a terminal course, and it looks like at this point either this is going to succeed or not, but it's going to succeed without me because I am dying. Um, so there maybe there was a cleanup process. Exactly what happened after that, I just don't know, right? It's to me the most important aspect here is watching Hal create and release Bitcoin. What happens after that, wherein he was almost immediately diagnosed with ALS? It's complicated. It's something that there are so many explanations for. People can debate them forever. To me, knowing Hal, knowing Len, watching this process for decades, that's where you realize, oh, that's how Bitcoin was created. I wasn't there for who sent this Bitcoin transaction. Was Hal was running this race at 8:30 in the morning. I don't know. Was it Len? Was it Hal? I don't. I personally, I just don't care. It's not relevant to the story. The story is who created Bitcoin, and Hal would have wanted to create RPAL 4.0. He would have wanted to solve the privacy problems. Whether it would have been like Zcash or something more Hal style, who knows, right? But Hal was a software engineer. This was a version of something he'd been working on for many, many years, and then he got diagnosed with ALS immediately. It's
Okay.
that's obviously a very sad story,
I mean, in fairness,
but it's
the
profound. I mean, it's
timestamps in
great.
Bitcoin are issued by the miner, right? And they're not really checked. So there's even some instances where the time ordering just doesn't make sense, right? So sometimes the timestamp is of the next block is prior to the previous block because they are not really checked, right? I mean, in Bitcoin, I mean, they're a little bit play a role, I think, in the automatic mining difficulty adjustment. So if the mining is too fast, then the difficulty gets automatically raised as part of the code. But so there is some room for manipulation, even though whether hell, if he was, was thinking when, I'm probably not a good athlete, but I'm also a little bit into sports and you get a little bit competitive no matter how bad you are, you want to run this to as fast as possible, usually when you take in these competitions, even if you're like a leisure athlete. So I'm not sure whether he would have thought that he had to kind of place a red herring there when he was running. But of course, it's possible. He might have manipulated the timestamps and so on, when he was the only miner kind of, but that would have meant that he would have to anticipate that the transaction that he issues, I mean, the timestamp of the transaction is essentially the timestamp of the block, as far as I understand Bitcoin, right? So you would have to anticipate then that he wins that block, which probably had a quite high chance, so you can manipulate the timestamp. But I'm not sure whether I mean, you probably take it to a certain level, but to play around with that would be unlikely. But let's say it was Len, right? What I was and all that I admit, like all my theories, also just probabilities, right? There's always some workaround. You could probably for everything I raised, you could find a reasoning why that happened and why it's still possible that it was Hal and Len. But coming back to the creation of Bitcoin, I mean, in the white paper, right? Actually, it talked way more about timestamping, right, than I think, I mean, four of the eight citations, so half of the citations were all about time stamping, right? So when you discussed with Hal, how much did time stamping actually play a role, or do you think that was something he just discovered afterwards and just took it as Satoshi Nakamoto in his kind of secrecy vault? I mean, why are they like essentially like there's a really weird citation from a symposium, and I have a long chapter on that where that comes from. I talked to the editor of that. So citation two is kind of I'm not sure whether you recall that. It's a really weird citation that you hardly find anywhere on this planet. And I talked to the editor who organized the workshop where it's presented, and he said it was before the Bitcoin white paper came out, it was only available as a paper platform, probably a couple of loose pages. And people said, okay, that was in the Leuven library because there were a couple of participants from that symposium, and Hal Finney would have had access to it provably, right? So that's also one thing that people, when they say Satoshi was Hal Finney, Len Sassaman, comes into the equation. But the whole concept of timestamping, did you ever discuss that with Hal Finney or Len Sassaman, or was that never really raised?
I think from a software engineering perspective, when you look at this problem, timestamping is uh, definitely one of the big ones. When you go from RPAL, where you have a centralized system, there's only one clock in a
Yeah.
centralized system. It's whatever clock is on your computer. And the IBM processor, and that when you're only sitting there with one dependency, it's a totally different world. And so you really have to focus on, okay, now I have a global system of servers. And they knew from, Bram and all the experience in this area with remailers, et cetera, that timestamping and having everyone agree on a very precise timestamp, right? You want lots of digits of precision on this time.
No,
Um,
it's actually in Bitcoin, it's more like a before after, right? So as I said, the actual timestamp is essentially something issued by the successful miner. So that can even be tweaked. It's only that this block is after that block, right? And you can never write something in the previous blocks to kind of reverse essentially the time. So it's not about the exact time, at least not in Bitcoin. In other applications, of course, it is. But it's only like, is that block after that one? Essentially, that's what Bitcoin secures, and not the exact time, the time of the day or time zone or something like that.
and
That is
when you
something.
take when you take 10,000 computers in all the different time zones, um, and you get all this fuzziness back in the 2009 era, you're going to end up with some serious time issues. So it's something you need to really focus on, and whether you end up using the last millisecond or whether that becomes relevant only in
No,
one in
there
a
are
million
major discrepancy.
transactions.
It is not the whatever the how do you call that, the latency times and so on and time zones. It's just before after, right? So the blockchain essentially is that mechanism that essentially proof of work kind of is used in a very clever way to just assure that block 12 is after block 11, right? And then all these transactions in block 12 cannot be cannot be edited by making something else block 10 again. So block 10 gets immutable after, well, statistically they usually say like 6 or 10 blocks, practically maybe even closer, right? And that before and after, it's not really an exact timestamps. It's just before after cannot be manipulated
But
with
it's
the
a
proof of
foundational
work.
service is the basic point,
Yeah,
right? If you
well,
don't
I don't
have
have
reliable time,
well,
then you have a
before
problem.
after, I think. I mean, it wouldn't matter if you can write whatever timestamp in it. The blockchain only cares which block number or block height or whatever you call it, right? It's
Well,
never really about exact times. So
there are
the question and
dependencies
what,
between the
yeah, yeah.
blocks, right?
And
From one block
why,
to the next. You can't
yeah,
just
like
have,
before
well, now I
after.
have an idempotent block 12 and block 14 doesn't depend on it, right? The whole concept of a blockchain is that actually every block more or less depends on the previous block. So,
Exactly, right? You make
um,
that statistically impossible to rewrite the blockchain. So like the longest chain wins essentially is that common phrase that they say. But I mean, like when you go back, I mean, like at least of course that could be something that Satoshi Nakamoto did part of the OPSEC kind of to essentially obscure where he actually came from. So you could say, okay, it was Hal Finney. He of course
right.
didn't cite RPow as his CodeCon presentation because then evidently everybody would have pointed at him. That's quite logic, right? but
Right.
like
I mean, isn't
still
that
he,
highly suspicious? I think that that I'm
yeah,
glad that got into the
there's
film because it's,
that
it's a
exactly. I mean,
serious
the
issue.
citations are really, really weird, right? So if the story is true, like Satoshi was actually quite, why did he reach out to Adam Back? I mean, he had already Bitcoin, right? He didn't need that. He just reached out to him, which ideally, if you're Satoshi Nakamoto, you would have reached out to nobody, right? Because kind of even the person you reach out to could be a trail to yourself, right? And so
Yeah.
he did
So
that, and then he didn't know the work by Wei Dai, right? And then if you look at the white paper again, there you have like these two citations of websites that you couldn't usually use very good in a, let's say, in an academic paper, right? And then you have four citations, all essentially coming out of a 99 paper. So all the following three timestamping are essentially the standard papers, more or less, that people who were involved in digital timestamping cited, and they were essentially work from early 1990s by Haber and Stornetta, right? Who are the standard citations of digital timestamping. Okay, and then you have four more citations, right? So there's these four timestamping, then the two web links to Adam Back's work and the work that Adam Back pointed Satoshi Nakamoto to in out of his own initiatives. Okay, and then you have two remaining citations, which is Ralph Merkle with the Merkle trees, a very weird one, right? Not the one that you usually find. It's actually quite, it's some, I think, 1980 paper or something, where Ralph Merkle had already like some review papers on it, because it's quite famous in whatever, computer science and so on. And then he cited a book from that's a standard book on probability theory that was essentially issued many, many times, but the author died in 1970, 70, right? And it had many, let's say, post-mortem new editions. That's quite common if you have a standard book in academia that some others take over, but you don't remove the name because it's that big name that sells the book. But that book, in the edition that he cited from 1957, 57, would
right.
not really be a typical citation because that must have been your grandfather who was in college at the time, right? Like in 1957, so probably if you're like 20 years old in college, in high school, you wouldn't touch that book. You must have been, that person owning the book must have been born in the 1930s, right?
Right.
Before computers were even invented, right?
So,
And
I mean
and
that
and
that reference is covered in the film. Again, it's to me it's just whatever book is sitting on the shelf, and it's a 9 page
No,
white
I
paper
mean
you're
the
trying to
problem is
establish.
that book doesn't exist, right? I went to all the archives of university. I'm pretty good at that. I'm not good at cryptography, but that's what I've written hundreds of papers myself in my field, and I know how to do citations and search them, right? And that book, in the form it was cited, doesn't really exist, right? It I found no library who really had it in the way he cited it. There's some close to that, but I mean Satoshi was very precise. He hardly had any typos, way less than any other people. So he really checked, what he was typing, and he reached out to authors, like Adam Back, right? And kind of like, look here, like please help me on whatever, updating the link and so on. And then he threw in that thing, right? And I was just wondering, were there any indications that Hal Finney was somebody who was in the history of computer science or math? It wasn't even computer science, it was probability theory, so statistics essentially, and so on. And then the time stamping. I mean, like probably a single citation would have done it, right? Because like the second
I think that
citation,
uh, if you look back at the RPAL materials, this is not Hal's way of expressing himself. This detailed academic white paper, just as in the film. Bram says Len, wasn't a coder, and he's really more of a he would have been better at the human textual content.
But also
Um,
with the citations, would you see
I
that
think if
he?
you I'm not going to speak to that specific citation or any of the others because either they're very clear or there's that one which you've done a lot of research on, and I think it doesn't really affect one's opinion of creation of Bitcoin per se. Um, maybe they put the year in wrong. I mean, who knows? I don't know anything about that one. That particular citation, I've always kind of looked at as like sort of this strangely generic, like I'm going to have a book about probability because it's related. Um,
Yeah, and then
I
you
don't
go
think it
so
really.
deep that you cite it essentially in the wrong way and deliberately cite some spurious kind of early edition that is not, that if you went to the librarian and said, "Give me that book," right, they
Right.
would stare at you,
But
right, and
right,
say like,
so Hal would have said we don't need that citation, in my opinion. Um, Len would have said, we have to be very pedantic about all these different things. This has to do with this, and so I'll have some citation, and maybe it got misquoted in the actual text there. So like, to me, this is all just more. Well, yes, Len wrote the white paper, and that all makes sense in context. Um,
can I
Len
just
did
jump
white
in
papers
there?
all the time like this.
How would you rank? Look, unfortunately, sometimes I have to read a lot of stuff from, let's say, early stage researchers. And I mean, Len wasn't an academic, right? I don't really want to, play that down, but he didn't even have a PhD, or
Right, right.
he didn't. I mean, I don't really mean that in a negative way. There's good. I mean, like Bill
No,
Gates
no,
didn't
I
have a
totally agree.
PhD. I mean, like
Right,
a lot of great computer geniuses didn't even finish college, right? Like they didn't
right,
even
right.
have a master's in computer science or so on, and they did fantastic things, right? I mean, Elon Musk doesn't have a PhD or so, you know. I think like or whatever, like whoever. I mean, only the academic people do that, so it's not necessarily a sign he didn't know anything. But I mean, in terms of when I see junior people with great minds writing their first paper single-handedly, right? That is not really the thing how they would create a reference list. And the second thing, and I really want to get your angle at it because there's very different angles, but I think for, let's say, an early academic, and I don't think Satoshi Nakamoto, for various reasons, was a senior, highly accomplished academic, right? Maybe in the cypherpunk scene or so, but not in an academic sense, right? And I think that the white paper is absolutely a brilliant piece. It would have probably never made it to a major, let's say, top quartile journal, not because the idea is not great, but because they made some clerical, I would say mostly formal mistakes, and of course in typical journals you would have to deliver it already when you write it. You cannot just propose a concept, which is not the flaw of the paper. It's just like, the way you publish is usually that you have to have done it before. They don't want to see just concepts being thing, like, oh yeah, we can do all these great things and this and this and this, but we haven't done it. Okay, but other than that, and I think that that is not a criticism, it's just like the normal practice. Um, it's a brilliantly written piece where I don't think I ever had a student, and I had, the whole range of PhD students and postdocs and colleagues and so on. And the way he explained it in the white paper without drawing people too much in the mathematical regime or computer science. I mean, essentially, you can understand the white paper without being an expert in cryptography or computer science, right? And he brilliantly kind of broke it down to all the pieces, right? And then said, look, you take this, you take this, you get this, you take this, and you can criticize a little bit, yet sometimes, let's say, a non-academic language actually for writing all that. In the math part, you see, he was not a hardcore mathematician because they would have written some of the, like the hand waving, let's say math he did there to justify how whatever, like how when a transaction becomes secure, essentially, statistically after whatever iterate or six block or so, you essentially are there. So after 1 hour, but it's a brilliantly written paper of someone who had really like a super sharp mind. And I mean, like beyond what, I don't have the best students in the world, they're probably more in Oxford or MIT or something like that, but I have very good students who really now have successful careers, are professors or something like that. And an early stage academic, I don't think having done this, what has nobody done before, and I truly see Bitcoin as that, just from the technical side, and then being able to boil it down to the white paper, right, is a brilliant work of somebody who can do extremely complex thinking and bring it down to something that other people can understand. Because Satoshi said himself, it's not easy to explain blockchain, right? Because it's so diametrically different to how we understand money, for example, or computing, right? And even that
Right.
I could understand it for the most part, even though I don't come from distributed computing or even computer science. I mean, I code a little bit, but that's far away from,
So
internet
I,
things and so on. So that is something where I wouldn't see Len Sassaman. I'm not saying he was a bad student, and I don't want to dwell too much on that he doesn't
right,
have
right.
a PhD. That's
So,
not for me the criterion, but that is something I could only see a pretty experienced, accomplished person who has a lot of self-confidence to bring that into a white paper and then kick it out. And the question would be, do you see like Hal Finney or all this together with the citations and so on, that is some magic done there, which has some characteristic weaknesses you wouldn't
right.
see with
So,
like some irrelevant almost weaknesses for the sake
so
of
first,
Bitcoin. But on the other hand,
uh,
a brilliant mind who has done complex software developments and got them across the
right.
line pretty much single-handedly.
So first, I would say there are a lot of Len white papers out there on the internet
But what
that
do
are
you mean
very
by
similar
white
to this.
papers? Like publication, like in journals or
Uh,
conferences, or what do you mean by white papers? Or on the cypherpunk scene with remailers?
Publications, of the publications of the Bitcoin white paper style. In fact, written just like it. They from
But not
10 feet
single
away, they look the same.
authoredly. But not single
Yeah, he got a bunch of
authoredly.
authors. So in other words, he
Yeah.
had been through many years during his PhD process where he's essentially writing white papers. He's doing cryptographic research, and this is what he's been doing now for some years. Could he have written that? I think it's the same level of math and skills that are demonstrated in his other white papers, where sure he may have had help. Um, Now, as to the specifics of the Bitcoin white paper, um, could Hal and he have done that? I definitely think so. However, what is evident from what we know is that they went through a long review process, right? And whether it was asking Adam back, as you mentioned, hey, is this reference okay? Do you have any other references, et cetera? Um, or other people unnamed to date who have not perhaps said that they are involved, but they may have provided review or suggestions or different improvements related to this. I mean, I definitely think we know that they went through a review process. What we don't know is who exactly were all of the reviewers. Um, we only know a small number of them. That doesn't mean that the other people weren't involved. In fact, I basically know that there are other people involved, and I suspect at this point in the forthcoming time period, now more people will be mentioning that. I think just like Fran in the film, uh, the overall kind of willingness to mention that they were involved, maybe just as a reviewer, some passive role, is now different after seeing the film for some people.
Yeah, but just coming
So,
back to your
oh,
like lens publication experience,
one
right? I
second.
mean,
I have
that
an
is
audio
not
issue.
documented, right? He essentially published everything with some people who were standing out. Like, so his
Still an
people
audio
at,
issue. Oh, there you are. All right, you're back. Sorry.
yeah. So he published with David Chong, right? Who is kind of the godfather of the academic kind of cryptography scene, or one of them, right? He essentially established the crypto conference and so on, and was the man behind eCash in the 1990s. He worked with, I think, I hope I pronounce his name right, George Danezis, right? That is an absolute stellar researcher that he was with at Leuven, right? And all the papers except for the Chom paper, he had, like, before 2008, he had five publicly documented paper, only one single authored one, actually the first one that cannot even be retrieved, on the promise of privacy in 2002, right? All the other papers were multi-authored, and Len was only once the first author, like with his Pynchon gate, right? So and then he had a couple of papers. Some of them were even published post-mortem after Bitcoin, right? So if we talk about the Bitcoin and his publishing experience, I wouldn't. I mean, it was actually good, right? For somebody who didn't really study, that's amazing. But I would say there's still a difference to his to the wit and the ingenuity you need to write this white paper to describe how blockchain works for the first time in the entire history of mankind, right?
I
That's a
mean,
big difference.
I think that's a very, we have to remember that I think that's a very modern perspective, right? We now view Bitcoin as super profound. But as you said earlier, there were a lot of people, especially early on, who thought, come on, the privacy, you can track these things. They're all sort of, even Len was one of the people saying publicly that there are problems. So that's a perspective we hold today in 2026 of, wow, this profound white paper changed everything. But in October 2008, I think people held a very different
Yeah, but I
perspective, and
don't
you
mean
really had to
Bitcoin. I
refine it.
mean, just look at the writing of the Bitcoin white paper, regardless of whether you like Bitcoin, whether you find the anonymity essentially like neglected or something like that. I just mean, I just compare the mindset from somebody who has written this paper, maybe just as a technology, not even whether it, regardless of whether it went to the place where we are looking at it in hindsight, as you say. And I don't think there would have been any student I ever had, or even postdoc, who would have had the brilliance, this exceptional brilliance to boil it down to what the white paper, how the white paper was written with all its weaknesses, right? But all the weaknesses are essentially like of a jack of all trades who just roughly understand, like it's essentially an interdisciplinary thing where you bring like cryptography, actually not so much cryptography, right? I mean, like Bitcoin essentially from the cryptography part could have written in the 80s or 90s. Actually, all the citations are actually from pre 2000, right? So it's not really like cutting edge cryptography for a good reason. It's pretty much like this mixture of how to bring it all together that it works, right? And whether he got lucky or not, but just
Right.
from the description, how he could describe what he did, whether it later turned successful or so, that was a brilliant mind. I would only see somebody who has had a significant list of
Right.
technological accomplishments, whether it was papers or companies or some contributions to companies, and
So
and
I
done
think
things
personally,
on his own
looking at Len's
steam.
white papers, I think personally looking at Len's white papers, I think he could do it with Hal and the reviewers that they had. Some have suggested, in fact, I think maybe even John suggests this. I'm not sure. Um, was there a third person? Was there a third person who was more of the academic, who could have provided more of this perspective that you're referring to? I look at the white paper, I compare it to Len's other white papers. I know Hal and Len. I think they are totally capable of this. However, was there a third person involved, possibly to help with some of this particular, wordsmithing in the white paper? I might call that person a reviewer. That another person might have said, well, actually, no, this is the third name on the white paper, but this is an anonymous white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, a fictitious name. So none of the people who created the white paper are on the white paper.
Okay, but you
Uh,
mean like if there were other people, right? Were they aware of this Satoshi Nakamoto game? Or were they kind of like tricked a little bit into, oh yeah, this is like look at it or so. But I mean, even that, they wouldn't then, it's like were there other people who know who was behind Satoshi Nakamoto? Or was it forwarded anonymously to somebody who hasn't come out of the woods by now? I mean that like if you really want to look at the origins of Bitcoin, I mean all your stuff makes sense from a technological perspective and so on. But I mean, if you look at what really happened, you run into this collusion problem, right? Everybody would tell you, like, if you have a secret, don't share it with too many
yes,
people.
yes. So you know what?
Yeah.
I just said that. I just said that to John, I think yesterday. And I said, but John, why would you even suggest that maybe there's a third person? And when Len and Hal seem clearly capable of this, and um, it just the to me it doesn't make sense. But there is no reason that it wouldn't have occurred, and I can't prove that it didn't. Most importantly, I know their circles. I know Hal and Len and their circle. What were the other cryptographers? Right, the dinner table analogy. Who's at that dinner table? Who did they know who could have helped with that? Those people do exist. And, Hal, John and I just went through a few of them yesterday and said, oh, I got, they probably sent it to that person for review. Um, to the extent that, some other person, some other well-known cryptographer, for example, would or could have helped with the white paper itself, uh, great. I think that's likely. I don't really call that a third creator, although in the academic world, you would definitely, I mean, just like, a writing credit on a movie, you would put that name
I
on the
call it a
film.
witness. Do you think there's somebody who has witnessed, so kind of would probably have survived the two of them? Because, like, if they were, like, say, your age or my age, typically most people are still alive at that age, essentially, unless they commit suicide or have a fatal disease, which happens. But statistically, if that person was already 80 years old and so on at the time. So you're talking about another, I'm not talking about another creator, I'm just talking about somebody who knew the game of Satoshi Nakamoto. So the names, the real names of the two people behind it, or that was approached by Satoshi Nakamoto, kind of don't tell anybody. And so he would know that he got an email at the time from Satoshi Nakamoto or some other pseudonym and had literally a draft of the white paper in front of him. So he would know, okay, I was approached. That person hasn't come out by at least so far. Not you're
Right.
saying they might come as a fallout from the documentary there. Like, how do you exactly what would be your best guess? I think we all
I
have to
think
guess around the
if you look at this person as a reviewer of the white paper, perhaps a minor
okay.
contributor, I don't
Okay,
think
so
it's a
he has
real
seen a
conflict.
document which would be quite similar to the white paper. So in hindsight, he would have known, oh yeah, I got that from Satoshi Nakamoto. And that's actually plausible because I have some, I call him a deep throat kind of insider that communicates with me under strict anonymity. I mean, I know his identity, and he's very credible, right? And extremely credible. And he said that Satoshi Nakamoto reached out to him, but that had never been documented in the Bitcoin era, right? So he got an email from Satoshi Nakamoto, you don't want to help us or me. Uh, important distinction there. You know, so that is not so unlikely that, let's say, Satoshi sent this paper as Satoshi to somebody he thought could put some increase the quality or the writing or say. Okay, but that person hasn't really come out. Okay, that's also possible because the person I'm talking to hasn't come out with that, you know? And okay, but if you like all these stories, you know, if you go through it, okay, so you're talking about a person who received a draft of the white paper prior to prior to Adam Back or in the same time at the same time as Adam Back. And that person hasn't come out, and we only know that um, Adam Back, Wei Dai, the people on the cryptography mailing list, or the thing was on the server, let's say a few weeks before the release of the Bitcoin white paper, and so there are people he approached. I mean, astonishingly, he didn't approach Nick Szabo, for example, or yeah, and hell, right, didn't receive a copy of the white paper. Okay, if we follow this theory of hell was part of Satoshi, that makes sense again, because then he would have sent it to himself, right? But now we are talking about a third person. So when did he come in? So he helped editing the white paper. He was a technical consultant after the code was already out or a draft of the code was out. What did he do after Len died and Hell was still alive for another roughly 3 years, even though quite restricted in his normal life and pretty much in a pretty sophisticated wheelchair? You know, what happened like to Bitcoin after Len Sassaman died? Was his third person still evolved? What did Hal Finney do? Right? So if
I mean,
you
I
if
don't,
you
I personally don't start from the precept of a third person existing. I consider that
okay.
person a reviewer or a contributor.
So
However,
he who
you
know
know, who
the
knows?
civil identity of Satoshi, or who just knew he received a paper version from Satoshi Nakamoto, a pseudonym from
I,
this email.
I think there was a review process. We know Adam Back was one of them. That doesn't mean
Yeah,
there was a
yeah,
review
okay.
process that didn't start even much earlier than that and might have involved um, not just checking a
Yeah.
citation,
Well,
right?
as far as I
Now
remember,
you're,
Adam Back wasn't asked for. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Adam Back was not asked to review the white paper. He was just asked whether he would be interested in August 2008 and shortly before he released the code, as you mentioned there, beginning of 2003, January, beginning of January
2009.
2009, right? And the same happened to Hell, right? Because Hell was kind of like a little bit off as far as I can recollect, right? So he kind of jumped on the list. He was one of the first to respond to the paper a few days later. And then essentially the whole discussion went a little bit offline, and then he got a little bit like a poke, the same way as Wei Dai also got one, but Adam Back and Wei Dai didn't really respond, right? They thought that is something that's not worth following, you know, which is a bit strange when you see Adam Back now being this enthusiastic Bitcoiner nowadays who kind of supports it extremely. But I mean, so you said, okay, there's not a third person, right? So what happened to all the Bitcoin, right? Okay, you have a Satoshi leaving in April, May 2011.
I think all the early Bitcoin, a lot of it is probably just destroyed, or it'll one day be destroyed, possibly in the quantum change.
Would Hal Finney
It's
have done that?
definitely. I think that everything generated in the early days of Bitcoin, everything generated, for example, in most in anywhere in 2008 or in 2009, to whatever extent
Yeah,
Hal was involved in generating Bitcoin during this time, I think it's equivalent to garbage. This is something with effectively no value. It is a version of software you might change tomorrow. And until it started having real users and a user base, and it started becoming something that Hal couldn't really per se control, there's no reason to keep most of this. Eventually, he collects whatever's on his hard drive, cleans it up, and has what he has.
yeah. Would hell
Um,
have raised? There was this one comment about carbon footprint in today's language, right? That raised hell in reaction to Bitcoin, right? So if he was the coder and he was so called environmentally aware in modern notation, right? Uh, would he ever have
I,
considered proof of work as the fundamental kind of engine of Bitcoin or even his RPO? But even more
I
Bitcoin,
don't,
of course,
again,
because
I think that gets into are we making Zcash or are we, or are we making Chia? These are all concepts that came later that are kind of interesting and in some way might be considered an improvement on, either proof of work or on, uh, other aspects of Bitcoin, the privacy and the security, et cetera. Obviously, this is just a version of software, right? Remember, the last time we spoke was in 2005 at the CodeCon conference, and it was World of RPow. That I was just presenting a couple slides where I said, hey, what if we made this out of servers and didn't use the IBM coprocessor? Now I'm saying, hey, we're going to use a node based network just like Tor and BitTorrent. And the next thing could be, okay, you know what? There are all kinds of privacy issues here. We're going to help the anonymity and the security of the system. Um, or maybe we'll have an alternative to Hashcash as proof of work. This is just software we keep developing, right? And the problem is that that got stopped immediately.
yeah, but Satoshi said something like I cannot say it literally, right? That he had to make sure that once the alpha version is out or the beta version, the one that was released, as you said, on 8th of January 2009, depending on the time zone you're looking at it, it was 8th or 9th. Um, so he was very conscious about, okay, nobody can change the fundamental rules, right? Maybe update the library or so, but the basic framework of this 21 million kind of total supply, the halving period. Um, I mean, essentially, he kind of predicted that not much more could happen to it than has happened today, right? So of course you could. I'm not sure whether Satoshi, if he was still alive, which couldn't be the case when if it was Hell and Len, right? But he kind of extrapolated to the future. He didn't say nobody should change the code, but the basic framework of, as I said, the 21 million supply, the halving, the block time, and all that, I think he considered as permaware. And at some point, I think somebody on the mailing list on the Bitcoin forum, I think it was, said something like about privacy and so on, and he was actually cautiously receptive for it. And then he said he dabbled around a little bit, and then he pulled out one particular paper from a person I actually contacted about it, right? But that wasn't really the signature that like I think Hell or um, or Len could have given a much more qualified answer, just like you, right? You immediately pointed to what later became Zcash or Monero or so. I think somebody in privacy technology could have easily addressed that issue and would have picked up on it to a much greater extent than I would have thought that comes from somebody who was at PGP in the very early days and Len Sassaman kind of making online privacy kind of his life theme, right? That
I
that was
think,
a very like kind of like, oh yeah, that's great, you
right.
know. I mean
But
that
this
was
is
the tone
software
of it,
engineering.
but then he had like a pretty random suggestion, right, to a paper that wasn't even published, just some concept paper that never went into the public domain really, other than on that mailing list, right? I think a privacy expert would have kind of um, lunged onto this topic and tried to, oh yeah, you guys are great. How can we change Bitcoin? And he wasn't unpolite. He took that serious, but he kind of tried to get out of that quite quickly. And I think a Hell and a Len would have not being able to avoid discussing this problem with a response to this what somebody on the list there brought up, right? So that would have been an opportunity where an anonymity fanatic couldn't have avoided talking about this, right? The other thing is, I think Hal, especially Len, couldn't have avoided the cypherpunk kind of politics that he was so much into, right? Like that, the
Oh, I think
technical
okay,
tone.
on that aspect, I would actually I'm usually in a bit of a gray area, not really disagreeing with you on these, but that statement right there, I think Len was so into anonymity and privacy that he was the best person I may have ever met for keeping your secret. So in the movie again gets into this concept of um, once you go beyond two people, keeping your secret is going to be real hard. And so in reference to this third person that we were just talking about, uh, how can you possibly expand to three people? Someone's going to blab this, right? This is breaking all the effort you spent on anonymity. But I would say this: cypherpunks, not as an entire group, I wouldn't trust them all, but cypherpunks generally have a lot of people who I think break the third person is going to blab your secret problem. And actually, John and I went through a list of these people yesterday, and I totally agree that there are some people that could have been minor contributors or certainly reviewers. There are undoubtedly reviewers we don't know about who would never, to this day, discuss it. And I absolutely believe that. Now, I don't think those people are involved on a day-to-day basis going forward. In fact, I'm not even, I don't think Len's that involved going forward. I think there are certain things that he did, and he had access to the NIM accounts, et cetera. But I just don't think he's that involved. And you can hear either Len or Hal in a lot of the posts, and if they and since I was managing Hal for 15 years, I have to say my internal stylometry goes off on some of the posts. It's clearly Hal, and this one feels like Len.
Okay, even though the stylometry, yeah, I mean the formal stylometry, but again, that can be tricked by somebody who is versed in that, would more point to hell if it was one of them, right? If you
Right.
just
So
take the
stylometry
post.
is doing a lot of technical things, right? It's saying, oh, look, you
Exactly, yeah,
spelled
yeah.
color with a OU. My
I think
internal
that can be
stylometry
easily
looking at his
faked. Yeah,
code is different,
yeah, yeah.
or his posts. Easily
Okay,
faked. Absolutely. Well, not only that, but we had tools at PGP that did some of these things, right? So we had we had this like source code analysis tool called Coverity, which would look for security flaws in the code at the time. We had all these tools that would, in an automated way, look through code. And today with AI, it's like whatever. I did all that this morning in 5 seconds. But back then, things to defeat stylometry, things to analyze source code en masse were rare, new, and different. But they were things that we had and were dealing with at PGP. So he would have been very familiar with those tools.
okay. Look, we're I'm stressing here your time allocation here. I mean, just to summarize, if we now if you take into account like what we discussed, maybe the points I brought up, right? So what would be as a conclusion be um your hypothesis or the most likely hypothesis that about the creation of Bitcoin and the involvement of Hell and Len Sassaman, uh, you would still say that most likely it was Hal Finney and Len Sassaman, and maybe some reviewers, or did I understand that correctly? If you just want to bring it down to a single paragraph to conclude, or what would be the thing that you would put your money on if you had to?
To me, I started believing, knowing that Hal created Bitcoin. Then there was this whole multi-year period where, for reasons we don't need to get into, No one wanted to talk about who created Bitcoin for a while. So now that we're back in the land of the free, um, I think the Len aspect was something that I didn't realize until much later, after significant additional research related to the film. So if you talk to people who worked at PGP, people on the technical side, we had in the end 83 engineers, 325 people. It was eventually sold off to Symantec in 2010. And if you talk to a lot of these people, which I've done since the film, they're all like, "But we all knew Hal created that. Like, what? Why is there a film needed for this? Didn't everybody know?" Right? There was a clip in the film early on that unfortunately didn't have time for, I guess, but it was about a Facebook post I made in 2017 where I explained that Hal created Bitcoin and that it was, why is everyone acting like this didn't happen? Is this not plainly obvious? And I went through all the various details. And originally I talked about that in the film. And again, you go through all these different people who worked at PGP, knew Hal, worked with Hal. We knew about RPAL. We see the progression from 1994 when I started working with him to 2009. And it all is like, how did we get on these sidetracks of like someone's like, whoever these other people who created Bitcoin, people say. It's hard to believe. So yes, absolutely, I'm still on the bandwagon of how created Bitcoin. I do think Len was involved. I think his white papers show that he was exactly the kind of person who could have written those white papers. There were undoubtedly different reviewers and minor contributors and et cetera. But all of the different pointers from RPAO to World of RPAO to the references in the white paper and on and on and on. I'm trying to condense years of research into seconds here, but all strongly point to Hal. And my one wish, other than Hal surviving, would be that he had completed this vision. Because to me, this is RPAL 3.0. And as a software engineer, the most exciting part would have been, now where do we go with 4.0 and 5.0? That's what we did, right? Is we said, okay, now this blockchain thing, wow, I've been working on this for 5 years. I got to do a software release. We got to get this out there because this is super profound. I know it has privacy issues. I know, it's using too much energy. Like, there's definitely going to be a problem. But it is still profound, and we can fix those things over time, right? At PGP, one of the big things we did that took years was we converted everyone from RSA encryption public keys to Diffie-Hellman DSA public keys. And so we literally changed all the cryptography right down to the symmetric cryptography. And this was, the reason you say, no, we don't want to change anything. We don't want to change, we're not going to change the 21 million. We're not going to change any of these different major attributes of the system. Don't touch that, is because that's a software release. That's RPAL 3.0. You can't change those things, or you're changing the fundamental nature of the system. But over time, as has been proposed recently, various different proposals, I'm not supporting them, but for the quantum crypto protection in Bitcoin, at some point, you can make major changes. And I think Hal would have been great at leading which of those changes to make, when, and how. And we'd done a lot of them at PGP, and he was great at it. And it's sad we don't have that leader. And I think that's part of my issue since I posted on Facebook in 2017 is, to me, I suppose some people have fallen in love with this mystique of the secret creator of Bitcoin. And, it's just the generic statue. And, oh, that's all wonderful. You can think, well, at least the guy who created it wasn't an axe murderer. And, so Bitcoin must be nice and pure. But actually, he was an incredibly great guy who so strongly believed in privacy, security, and anonymity, and did these things for decades and decades, and did them at the with his family and not making money and all these things, that it's better to know that this is actually the person who created it than to think that it was this anonymous person. It turns out it's a really great story of how he created it. And he was a great guy.
So my point would be I fully buy your story. It's just like too many things from my research that I kind of like explained over many, many pages in my book comes to a different conclusion. I think I would fully support that the technical capabilities and the mix of Len Sassaman and Hal Finney at the core makes so much sense. There are just too many contradictions. So they certainly could have done it from if you just look at the people and all the things you lined out. But I think I have two, three, four more evident candidates who essentially one of them ticks pretty much all the boxes that would resolve the apparent contradictions. I'm not saying I know who it is, but it's just like there are too many contradictions in that the team story and some other stuff we have discussed about. But look, guys, I recommend watching the movie there. I think there's some great insights into the history of what led to Bitcoin, and maybe I leave it up to my audience to make up their own mind. I don't think there, and it's a good thing actually that there's no, it seems to be there's no proof that can like find absolute certainty who did it. Because I think that can only be done more or less voluntarily by the creator of Bitcoin himself. If it was Hal and or Len, they cannot do it evidently anymore. And if it was somebody else, what would be my best guess from my analysis, he probably chose not to do it, even though I think he can. So thanks a lot, Will, for being available here now for some excessive amount of time. But it was extremely good to hear your angle, and certainly you have so much insight into this that no matter what you think who Satoshi was or is, you learned a lot about this. At least I did. So thanks a lot, Will, and thanks for everybody listening. Bye bye.
Great. Thank you.